culture. So I've kind of brought up some ideas. So hopefully you're just interested in the idea of culture. I put a little bit finer point on this, but I want to refine this idea further because culture is one of these words that comes up all of the time. And you use it every day, this word culture, but we use it a little bit differently in anthropology. So here's one definition. As I've said before, if you ask a bunch of anthropologists the definition of culture, you'll get a million different answers. But culture, this is one example, consists of the abstract ideas, values, and perceptions of the world that inform and are reflected in people's behavior. Culture is shared by members of a society and produces behavior that is intelligible to other members of the society. So it's one of these big definitions that means almost nothing. At the same time, anthropologists choose these words extremely specifically, and that's a little odd. So let's move on to talk about it. We haven't done this before, right? I'm having flashbacks. Okay, I think I did this in a different class, so sorry if I'm always asking, like, do you know this? When I say the word culture in popular, if you hear the word culture on the news, if somebody else that hasn't taken much anthropology uses the word culture, the layman term culture, they're probably talking about what we say is surface culture. So if maybe you're going to go visit another country, you're going to go visit Mexico, and you pick up a Lonely Planet Mexico, a cultural guide to the country you're going to. The very first chapter is going to be about surface culture. It's going to be about the food, the flag, the festivals, fashion, holidays, music, game, dance, performance, arts, literature, language. All these things we're all perfectly cognizant and aware of is culture. But that's surface culture, and that's not what we tend to be most interested in anthropologists. We tend to, as you sort of learned in the Nasarima reading, where we tend to be more interested in the parts of culture that you don't see, the parts of culture that you take for granted, what we call tacit or deep culture, the culture that you're perfectly aware of, but you're not always cognizant of. You're tacitly aware of it. You're not aware that you're aware of it. So this is what we call deep culture, communication styles and rules. So yeah, sure, language is a part of culture, but what about facial expressions, gestures, eye contact, personal space? That was a hard one for me in Korea. Touching. I remember when I'd be on the subway or just standing in a crowded, one time I was standing at a crowded intersection waiting for the light to turn green so I could cross walking. Like some people would just reach out and start stroking my arm. Now, in the United States, where used to live in Chicago, that probably wouldn't be taken the same way. But I didn't act like I would have in Chicago and like Peter ran away or hit them. It didn't induce my fight or flight. I was more curious, and they said to me in Korean, they're like, "Oh, I've just never seen somebody with so much hair on their arms." They were just stroking my arm because I'm a hairy beast, and they thought they just don't see that. My wife Jen, she's like a curly blonde, and people on the subway would just start touching her hair and be like, wow, this is interesting, never seen it before. That doesn't fly in the United States. That's a different kind of culture, and it's often the stuff that's most shocking. Let's talk about facial expressions. I have an example of this. So we've been talking about the globalization of McDonald's. In Russia, McDonald's also expanded to Russia in the 1980s. And did I tell? I'm just going to tell it again, so I don't have to keep asking. Did I tell this story? But they expanded to Russia, and at that time the McDonald's their slogan was "Service with a Smile." That was their slogan, "Service with a Smile." And so, just like in the United States, they trained all their new Russian employees to smile, grin at these customers that were coming in. And after a few months of that, it turned out that there was a massive amount of fist fights that were breaking out between employees and customers in Russia. So now that I've been talking for a while, why do you think that was happening? Why was that happening in Russia? Anybody? What does a smile mean in Russia? Anybody want to take a guess that would cause a fight?
I'm taking a complete guess, but I'm sorry.
That's what I'm looking for, a complete guess.
Complete guess. Maybe it means that you feel superior to the person and you're looking down on them.
In a way, yeah. If you smile at a stranger in Russia, they don't understand why you're being polite to them for no reason. They think that you're laughing at them.
Right.
So they take it as an insult. They're like, what do you think you're better than me? You're laughing at me just because I work at McDonald's. And so they'd get into these fist fights. They would break out all the time. So they had to backpedal that. It's just an example of this deeper culture that you might not necessarily read in travel guides, and that you might not even think to ask, what does a smile mean? So again, deeper culture, notions of courtesy and manners, friendship, what counts as a friend, what doesn't count as a friend. I had a friend in Korea that was an older gentleman in his 60s. He was a traveler, had great stories, but all my Korean friends just thought it was the strangest thing that I had a 60-year-old man who's a friend. They're like, "What is he, like a father figure?" I'm like, "No, we just go drink together. He's cool." But they just couldn't get over that, like who you're allowed to be friends with, who you're not allowed to be friends with. Concepts of self, time. We tend to think that time is the same for everybody, but that is not true, as we will talk about when we talk about that later. Attitudes towards elders, adolescence, age, sin, death, religion, courtship. I don't need to read all these, but the point is that most culture is deep culture. Most of the interesting stuff of culture is deep culture, and most of that stuff we are not necessarily aware of. Any questions about this? So let's talk a little bit about the history of the cultural concept. The concept of culture is very much from anthropology. Anthropology has had we sort of invented the culture concept in terms of it having explanatory power in our discipline, and now lots of other disciplines use the culture concept. But when we came up with it in the early 19th century, we came up with it for a lot of racist and colonialist ideas. Most anthropologists were part of the colonial project. The very first anthropologists were colonialists. They went out in order to learn about the natives, in order to learn about other cultures, not to study them to be cultural relativists, to be like, oh, look at this primitive people. I bet we used to be like them. They are less evolved than us. And this knowledge is going to be beneficial to my country in governing them, in taking them over, in taking their resources, or enslaving them. So anthropologist as a discipline really comes from this racist, was born out of this racist colonialist past. Now, before you drop my class, anthropology also today is on the vanguard of trying to correct these issues and push back against these issues and trying to sort of atone for some of these original sins. But in this 19th century European ideal, anthropologists went out and they thought that they had this idea of cultural development as evolution. And so they looked at not earlier cultures, there's no such thing as earlier cultures, but these less technologically advanced cultures, and they would classify them into this pyramid. Oh, this culture doesn't have a written language and they are polytheistic. Therefore, they fall into the lower savages. But this other culture, they have monotheism. They still can't read or write, but we'll call them, they can be upper barbarians. And wouldn't you know it, those white European male anthropologists, where did they put their own culture on this ladder? Well, right at the top. Clearly, their culture must be the absolute best, right? And of course, we don't do that anymore, as hopefully you've gotten out of my lessons of cultural relativism. It's very Eurocentric, we might say. Ethnocentric is another way to say it. So they believed in this simplistic, uniform cultural development. If you were a lower savage, you couldn't tomorrow turn into an upper barbarian. You had to first become a middle savage, and then an upper savage. And then over a long enough period of time, everybody would eventually turn into civilized Europeans. But of course, that's not how it works. So this theory's ranking system, which used European culture as the ideal standard, is now considered extremely racist.